One of my favorite streaming releases of 2022 was Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities. Currently, it has a 94% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes, and very likely will be given a second season. Fingers crossed on that, because this is one of my favorite releases of the past year that I can't stop talking about, thinking about, and I thought it'd be a really great idea to share with you all who might also be just as in love with this series as me, some book recommendations that relate in some way, whether theme, setting, motifs, to some of my favorite episodes that appeared in this anthology. Cabinet of Curiosities was such a refreshing and inspiring infusion of all the things that I love about horror. So many episodes include themes and storylines revolving around grief. There's the motif of human monsters and confronting man's inhumanity. A lot of the episodes, not all, but a lot of them included social commentary about beauty standards, immigration. It's just all the stuff in the horror genre that I live for. One of my favorite episodes in this series is titled Graveyard Rats. I like this episode for its graveyard setting, and also it does a really good job of making you feel a lot of suffocating emotions. It reminded me a lot of watching the movie Barbarian, in that I had no clue where the story was taking me, and that at some point I'm like, okay, anything can happen, and just like let it happen, like experience it for what it is, and it was a really fun ride. Another thing I found really entertaining and funny is that you really don't like the main character, and so whatever kind of mischief and mayhem he gets himself into, it's kind of like, okay dude, like you're digging your own grave here, you did this to yourself. Sticking with that theme, a book that comes to mind for me that really hits this point as well is going to be Grave Robbers Wanted, No Experience Necessary by Jeff Strand. In this book, you also have a main character who also finds himself digging up graves as a grave robber, but just gets himself in the most like weird, sticky situations that in your mind, you're like, okay, how are you like letting this happen? Like you should not have gotten yourself into the situation at all, and yet you're there. It's a horror comedy that is written in a very funny way. Like I found it to be very funny. It's a little slow towards the middle, but it definitely ramps up at the end, and the gore factor is there. So this book also has a character that I feel like is really digging their own grave and creating their own troubles for themselves. Another book, Below by Laurel Hightower, comes to mind for me when I think about this Cabinet of Curiosities episode, because in Below you have a woman who is going to like great depths physically, but also like as she goes down into a certain location, it's also kind of symbolizing her going deeper and deeper into her own psyche. So I feel like that same kind of like level change that shows up in the episode also comes into play here. Also, Below has a really interesting creature as well, and there's also a creature in the Graveyard Rats episode. And I think you can guess which kind of creature is in this episode, just by the title alone. I also wanted to recommend a nonfiction book that if you are a fan of horror, I'm sure you would definitely be open to reading this book. It's called From Here to Eternity by Caitlin Dowdy. She is a fellow YouTuber. She has a channel called Ask a Mortician, and she has several books about the mortician life, dispelling any misconceptions, and really trying to create a more death-positive society, which is something I'm all about. And this book is a really vibrant look at the different cultural practices surrounding death, any kind of methods for grieving, burial rites, funerary interpretations, depending on like different cultures around the world. And I thought it really resonated with the episode in the sense that like it's talking about the graveyard or like cemetery setting. I feel like the setting of the graveyard is so central to the plot of this story that it's definitely a relevant recommendation. One of the standout episodes in this anthology for me is The Outside. And although it's taking place in the 1980s, I feel like a lot of those beauty standards and expectations for how feminine people will present themselves are still definitely a big part of like the national culture, and if anything, have only gotten worse. So I think this story is timeless and timely, and it's actually based on a web comic by Emily Carroll. I'll be sure to link it down below. It's really cool. It's not entirely the same as the episode itself. So I think it's definitely worth a read if you were interested in the episode itself. You gotta read where it came from, the OG story. The social commentary in this episode is like off the charts. It is very overt, not a lot to like interpret, but I did really resonate with the whole push and pull, like that tension in your mind about like who you are, who you want to be versus the outside world creating that definition for you. And I think a really important book within the extreme horror genre that takes that same kind of like gruesome approach to these topics is going to be Plastic Monsters by Daniel Volpe. Again, this is an extreme horror novel, so tread with caution, but I've read a few extreme horror books and I don't think this is like the most extreme. So if you're already kind of well read within the genre, it won't be on that like far end when it comes like the gruesomeness and the gore, but it's definitely there. This book is the perfect counterpart to this episode. It follows a woman who goes to great gory lengths to achieve the body, the outside visual aesthetics. So she's also in search of this society approved definition of beauty, just like you see in that Cabinet of Curiosities episode. You see in this book also the destruction and what happens to you, like you become a monster yourself in pursuit of becoming beautiful. I read this book at the end of 2022 with Kelly from Kelly Hooked on Books as like a little buddy read, and I think this is a really standout book for me. That was a little bit triggering at times because you do see a lot of like that dark energy ruminating from the main character who has a whole lot of self-hatred. So if you're anybody like myself who's dealt with like body image issues, like body dysmorphia and kind of history with eating disorders, you might want to tread carefully with this book and maybe even the Cabinet of Curiosities episode because it's like really heavy. And I just remember like after I read this book a few days later just feeling like, ooh, like this is like kind of brought up some stuff for me. So definitely take care of yourself when embarking on reading this book. I also want to drop another nonfiction book recommendation for you here. I just wrapped up Jeanette McCurdy's I'm Glad My Mom Died, and that book, wow, like it is so heart-wrenching. I was kind of a little bit too old to be watching iCarly by the time it was coming out, but I definitely knew who Jeanette McCurdy was. She just seemed so happy, so funny, very outgoing, and you just never know when people are dealing with like some intense abuse or trauma or issues. Like it's just so wild to know how her upbringing, her mother specifically, created so many of the like trauma she's still dealing with as an adult. And I think that really resonates so much with the episode because you have people who are feeling like because of these like outside forces that they're trying to feel like this sense of acceptance from, that they're doing things that they would not normally participate in or do in order to like to please others. And it's just so heartbreaking. The one episode I thought just had the most beautiful set design and costuming was Dreams in the Witch House, which has huge prominent themes of grief and loss. Grief horror is one of my favorite things to watch, to read. It's like a huge part of how I feel like I process my own experiences with loss in my own life. And I feel like a book that perfectly, like too perfectly probably, like it hits the nail on the head right here, and that is Ghost Eaters by Clay McLeod Thompson. I just recently finished this book. It's about a group of friends who are incredibly codependent, like unhealthy attachments and connections in that friend group who come together to take this drug, and this drug is called Ghost, and it's all about getting haunted. And you have a lot of themes and issues regarding addiction, of, you know, substances, of friends. And these people get way more than they bargained for. This is a 5-star book for me. You also have some commentary regarding like history and like historical ghosts too. And also in your own life, like what does it mean to be haunted and who's haunting who? The descriptions and writing in that book is really unsettling at points, but like in the best way possible. And it's really obviously connected to this Cabinet of Curiosities episode because you have in the episode somebody taking a drug that they are using to like kind of explore a supernatural world where they are able to contact their deceased loved one, and how they're very much like stuck in the past themselves. 2 novellas who really capture that same weight of like grief that the episode does is going to be Crossroads by Laurel Hightower and Dear Laura by Gemma Amor. Both Crossroads and Dear Laura follow 2 women who are dealing with their own versions of like grief due to the loss of people that are really important to their lives. And it really does like project their life path, their life journey. It is what like is foundational to them as people and overtakes their lives in like so many ways that you see also in that Cabinet of Curiosities episode. Both Crossroads and Dear Laura are a little bit more like on the disturbing side. Crossroads gets heavy into the body horror, so be warned about that. A more cozy, whimsical option is going to be Under the Whispering Door by TJ Klune. It's a very sweet, whimsical book, but also like really emotional and honest about what it means to deal with like your mortality and to accept that and the mortality of other people. It deals with ghosts and like this really interesting interpretation of the afterlife. And it's a really important reflection on accepting death and like what does life look like after death. Even though you have the main character dealing with their own afterlife, I think it could be used as like a metaphor or some kind of like symbolism for trying to figure out your own life after somebody important to you dies. But it's really sweet, really loving. You have some great LGBTQ representation as well. So it's as close to romance as I've ever gotten. This episode grew on me. It wasn't one that I watched and I was instantly like obsessed, but after I thought about it and watched more YouTube videos on it and people's interpretations, I started to appreciate it a little bit more. I thought the ending itself was like a bit tacky and not well done, but I thought the story itself was really cool, and it was one of the episodes in the anthology that scared me the most. Like, it is creepy. So the themes really present in this episode are going to be art creating madness, creating worlds that are unsettling and uncontrollable. In a book I think that really speaks to that I've read last year is Junji Ito's Uzumaki. This is about spirals overtaking this town in Japan and all hell breaking loose because of it. Anybody who encounters them gets sucked into this world, to these spirals. They're very enigmatic and they're very mysterious, and there is a part of the book too in this manga horror series where you have an artist who also draws spirals. So I feel like it also connects back to the episode, as one of the main protagonists and antagonists is actually an artist who draws. Another book that deals with artists gone mad is Kill Creek by Scott Thomas. I read this book for Halloween, which was a readathon hosted by Lexi from Books with Lexi, and this book is a really beloved book. It wasn't one of my favorites, but I did really enjoy it for its haunted house trope. I think that's one of my favorite tropes. It follows a group of horror writers who descend into their own madness once they spend a weekend at this haunted house, and they're really overcome by this like supernatural power that impacts their literary work that they create. So that is very blatantly a storyline that shows up, but like in drawing like painter form within the Cabinet of Curiosities episode. So definitely like parallel stories there. In a nonfiction book that I think does relate to the episode is going to be The Radium Girls by Kate Moore. This is a historical topic that like guts me because it is just so sad but so preventable. This book is a tragic historical account of these factory girls who worked in the 1920s painting radium on these like watch dials, some of them even going to like the US government, and getting poisoned from radiation, ultimately dying like really gruesome deaths and trying to fight for monetary compensation from this company that did this to them. Like, they are young immigrant women who have very little resources, and their faces are just falling apart. Their bodies are immovable because of them licking the paint and then like having to be on these assembly lines painting this like glowy kind of material or chemical that was gonna be sold and made lots of profit for the company. Like, it's just awful. And so to me, you know, you have that paint element that also shows up in the Cabinet of Curiosities episode, and you have the destruction that it brings on these women's lives, just like art and paint brought so much destruction for the main character of that Cabinet of Curiosities episode. So now I bring it on over to you. I have a few episodes within this anthology that I absolutely adore, but could not for the life of me find books that were similar in theme or story. So I'd love some help. If you have seen the Autopsy episode as well as Lot 36, and you have books that relate to this, or maybe other like movies or TV shows, please write them down in the comments below. I am eagerly awaiting your responses so I could add those to my to be read or to be watch lists. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video. Bye!